There's nothing quite like the pain of being forgotten by the person who was supposed to love you most. David Morrison felt that familiar ache when the lawyer told him his estranged father had left him exactly $1 in his will. His father had walked out 30 years ago, leaving David's mother to raise him alone. Now, even in death, the man seemed to be delivering one last cruel message. David threw the will in the trash and went back to his real problems, paying rent and keeping food on the table for his teenage daughter. But the next morning, another lawyer showed up at his door with a different story. This man had keys and documents that would lead David to something his father had been hiding for decades. What David found would change everything he thought he knew about his family. It turns out his father had been keeping a secret that was worth millions of dollars. But would this unexpected fortune heal the wounds of abandonment or create new problems David never saw coming? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the thin curtains of David Morrison's two-bedroom apartment, casting long shadows across the cluttered kitchen table where bills lay scattered like fallen leaves. At 47, David carried the weight of responsibility in the set of his shoulders and the lines around his eyes, lines that had deepened considerably since his wife Sarah had passed from cancer 8 years ago, leaving him to raise their daughter Emma alone. David stood at the kitchen counter, nursing his second cup of coffee and staring at the latest stack of envelopes. The electric bill was past due, again. Emma's car insurance had gone up. The rent notice bore the familiar yellow tint that meant his landlord was getting impatient. He rubbed his calloused hands over his face, feeling the rough texture of skin weathered by years of working on engines at Murphy's Auto Repair. "Dad, you're doing that thing again," Emma said, appearing in the doorway with her backpack slung over one shoulder. At 17, she had inherited her mother's grace and intelligence, but David's stubborn determination. Her dark hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and she wore the kind of confident expression that reminded David daily how proud Sarah would have been. "What thing?" David asked, though he knew exactly what she meant. That brooding stare at the bills like you can make them disappear through sheer willpower. Emma grabbed an apple from the bowl on the counter and kissed his cheek. "We'll figure it out, Dad. We always do." David managed a smile. Emma had been saying versions of this since she was old enough to understand why they moved to a smaller apartment, why they shopped at thrift stores, and why her father worked extra shifts whenever possible. She had never complained, never asked for things they couldn't afford, and had somehow grown into a remarkable young woman despite the circumstances. "Speaking of figuring things out," Emma said, pulling a cream-colored envelope from her backpack, "this came yesterday." David's heart sank as he recognized the return address. Northwestern University. They had both known this day would come, but seeing the acceptance letter in his daughter's hands made the reality hit like a punch to the gut. Emma had worked harder than any kid should have to, maintaining a 4 GPA while working part-time at the library to help with expenses. She deserved this opportunity more than anyone he knew. "Open it," he said, though his voice came out rougher than intended. Emma's hands trembled slightly as she tore the envelope. Her eyes scanned the letter, and David watched her face transform from nervous anticipation to pure joy. "I got in, Dad. Full academic program. Exactly what I wanted." David pulled her into a hug, breathing in the scent of her shampoo and feeling the bittersweet mixture of pride and panic. Northwestern was one of the best schools in the country for her intended major in engineering. It was also expensive beyond anything their family budget could handle, even with whatever financial aid might be available. "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart," he said, and meant every word. "Your mother would be over the moon." Emma pulled back to look at him, and he saw the worry creeping into her expression. She was smart enough to know what this acceptance meant financially. "Dad, I know it's a lot of money." "Don't you worry about that," David interrupted, though he had no idea how he would make it work. We'll find a way. You focus on being 17 and enjoying your senior year." After Emma left for school, David sat alone with the acceptance letter, running the numbers in his head for the 100th time. Even with loans and financial aid, they would need at least $30,000 a year. His salary at Murphy's covered their basic living expenses, barely. He had already picked up weekend shifts at a second garage, but there were only so many hours in a week. The phone rang, startling him from his calculations. The voice on the other end was professional, formal, and completely unexpected. "Mr. Morrison, this is Charles Whitman from Whitman Pike Associates. I'm calling regarding your father's estate." David's grip tightened on the phone. "I think there's been a mistake. My father and I haven't spoken in 30 years. "There's no mistake, sir. I was your father's attorney. He passed away last week, and I need to discuss his will with you." The words hit David like a cold wind. His father was dead. Robert Morrison, the man who had walked out when David was 17, the same age Emma was now, was gone. David felt an unexpected hollowness in his chest. Not grief exactly, but something closer to the final closing of a door that had been left slightly ajar for 3 decades. "Mr. Morrison, are you still there?" "Yes, I'm here. When did he die?" "Last Tuesday. Heart attack. It was quite sudden." The lawyer's voice carried professional sympathy. "I know this must be difficult. Would it be possible for you to come to my office this afternoon? There are some documents that require your immediate attention." David found himself agreeing to a 2 o'clock appointment, though he couldn't quite process why. What could his father possibly have left him except more questions and old wounds? Whitman's office was located in the better part of town, in one of those renovated historic buildings that spoke of old money and established families. David felt out of place in his work clothes, conscious of the oil stains on his hands that never quite washed clean. Charles Whitman was a thin, precise man in his 60s who handled the meeting with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggested he had delivered difficult news many times before. "Your father's will is quite straightforward," Whitman said, sliding a document across the mahogany desk. "He has left you the sum of $1. David stared at the papers, reading the words but not quite comprehending them. $1. After 30 years of silence, his father's final communication was a single dollar. "That's it?" David asked, though he already knew the answer. "That's the extent of the bequest, yes." Whitman's expression remained neutral, professional. "I realize this might be disappointing." "Disappointing?" David stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "It's insulting. Even in death he can't resist one final slap in the face." He left the office feeling hollow and angry, the will crumpled in his jacket pocket. The drive home passed in a blur of familiar streets and half-formed memories. His father's face, younger then, disappointed and distant. The fights that had echoed through their small house. The morning David woke up to find a note on the kitchen table and his father's clothes gone from the closet. Emma was waiting for him when he got home, homework spread across the kitchen table. She looked up as he entered, immediately reading the tension in his posture. "Dad, what happened? You look like someone died." The irony of her words almost made him laugh. "Actually, someone did. Your grandfather." Emma's pen stopped moving across her paper. She had never met Robert Morrison, had only heard scattered stories about the grandfather who had left before she was born. "I'm sorry, Dad. Are you okay?" David pulled the crumpled will from his pocket and smoothed it out on the table. "He left me $1, Emma." $1. Emma read the document, her expression growing thoughtful rather than shocked. "Maybe there's more to it than that." "Like what? Some kind of lesson about the value of money?" David's laugh was bitter. "Your grandfather wasn't exactly the teaching type." But as the evening wore on, David found himself thinking about Emma's words. His father had been many things absent, difficult, stubborn to a fault, but he had never been petty or cruel for its own sake. The $1 inheritance felt deliberate in a way that nagged at David's mind. That night, He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling and remembering fragments of his childhood. His father working on old cars in their garage, teaching David the difference between a Phillips head and a flathead screwdriver. The smell of motor oil and the sound of classic rock playing on the radio, the pride in his father's voice when David successfully changed his first tire. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else, overshadowed by the years of anger and abandonment that followed. But lying there in the dark, David found himself wondering if he had missed something important, if maybe, just maybe, there was more to his father's story than he had ever known. The answer would come sooner than he expected. The knock on David's door came at precisely 8 o'clock the next morning, just as he was getting ready to leave for work. Through the peephole, he saw a well-dressed man in his 50s holding a leather briefcase, looking nothing like the bill collectors or salespeople who occasionally found their way to his apartment. "Mr. Morrison, my name is Thomas Harrison. I represent your father's estate." The man's voice carried authority and something else, urgency. "I believe Charles Whitman spoke with you yesterday about your inheritance." David opened the door reluctantly. "If you're here about that dollar, you can keep it. I'm not interested in playing whatever game my father set up." Harrison smiled, but it wasn't condescending. "May I come in? I think you'll find what I have to say quite interesting." Something in the man's demeanor made David step aside. Harrison entered the small apartment, taking in the modest surroundings with the kind of professional observation that suggested he was accustomed to evaluating people and their circumstances. "Mr. Morrison, what Mr. Whitman gave you yesterday was only the first part of your father's bequest. The dollar was, shall we say, a test of character." "A test?" David's voice rose. "What kind of test humiliates someone with a dollar inheritance?" "The kind that determines whether the recipient has the patience and maturity to handle what comes next." Harrison opened his briefcase and withdrew a manila envelope. "Your father was very specific about the timing. I was instructed to wait exactly 24 hours after the reading of the will before making contact." David stared at the envelope. "What's in there?" "Keys, Mr. Morrison, and an address." Harrison handed him the envelope. "Your father spent the last 30 years of his life building something quite remarkable. He wanted to ensure it went to someone who wouldn't act hastily, who would think before making decisions." David's hands trembled slightly as he opened the envelope. Inside was a brass key, old and well-worn, along with a piece of paper containing an address he didn't recognize. The key felt substantial in his palm, heavier than it looked. "What does this open?" "Drive to that address, Mr. Morrison. Use the key on the large roll-up door you'll find there. What you discover will answer many questions about your father, though it may raise others." Harrison stood to leave. "I should mention that the property is now yours, along with everything inside. Your father's will was quite clear on that point." After Harrison left, David sat at his kitchen table, staring at the brass key. Emma had already left for school, but he could hear her words from the night before, echoing in his mind. Maybe there's more to it than that. He called Murphy's Auto Repair and told them he would be late, then drove to the address on the paper. It led him to an industrial area on the outskirts of town, past warehouses and storage facilities, to a large, nondescript building that looked like it hadn't been disturbed in years. The lot was overgrown with weeds, and the building's metal siding had faded to a dull grey. David parked in front of the massive roll-up door and approached with the brass key. His heart was pounding in a way that reminded him of being 17 again, nervous and uncertain. The key slid into the lock mechanism smoothly, as if it had been used recently and often. The door rumbled upward, and David's breath caught in his throat. The warehouse stretched before him like a cathedral of automotive history. Row upon row of vintage cars filled the enormous space, each one positioned with mathematical precision. The air smelled of motor oil, leather, and something else, pride, perhaps, or dedication. Overhead lights illuminated the collection, revealing paint jobs that gleamed like jewels and chrome that reflected the fluorescent bulbs with mirror-like clarity. David stepped inside, his footsteps echoing in the vast space. A 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air in pristine turquoise and white sat nearest the entrance, its interior spotless and its engine compartment visible through a partially raised hood. Beyond it, a 1969 Dodge Charger in deep orange commanded attention with its muscular stance and racing stripes. He walked deeper into the warehouse, counting cars as he went. 20, 30, 50 vehicles, each one a masterpiece of restoration. Ford Mustangs from different decades, classic Camaros, elegant Cadillacs from the 50s, even a few European sports cars tucked away in corners. Every single car appeared to be in show-quality condition. Near the center of the warehouse, David found a work area with tool benches, hydraulic lifts, and equipment that looked professional grade. The tools were organized with military precision, each one clean and in its designated place. A pegboard displayed wrenches and screwdrivers arranged by size, and several rolling tool cabinets stood ready for use. On one of the workbenches, David found a thick binder labeled Inventory and Restoration Notes. He opened it with shaking hands and discovered page after page of meticulous documentation. Each car had its own section with before and after photographs, receipts for parts and materials, and detailed notes about the restoration process. The handwriting was his father's. He recognized it immediately despite the decades. The scope of the collection was overwhelming. According to the inventory, there were 87 vehicles in various stages of completion, though most appeared finished. The estimated values listed next to each car made David's head spin. Conservative appraisals ranged from $20,000 to over $100,000 per vehicle. But it was more than the money that stunned him. It was the evidence of years, decades of dedicated work. The careful attention to detail in every restoration, the obvious love and respect for each vehicle's history and craftsmanship. This wasn't the work of someone who had abandoned his responsibilities. This was the life's work of someone who understood value, who appreciated quality, who had spent countless hours perfecting his craft. David sank onto a stool next to one of the workbenches, the inventory binder heavy in his lap. His father had been here, in this place, working on these cars, while David had been growing up without him. While David had been learning to drive in his mother's old sedan, his father had been restoring classics. While David had been struggling to pay for trade school, his father had been building what amounted to a museum. The anger he had carried for 30 years began to mix with confusion and something else, a grudging respect for the skill and dedication represented by the collection. But that respect was tempered by a deeper hurt. If his father had been capable of this level of commitment to his hobby, why couldn't he have shown the same commitment to his family? David stood and walked to the nearest car, a 1965 Ford Mustang convertible in deep blue with white racing stripes. The top was down, revealing an interior that looked like it had just rolled off the assembly line. He ran his hand along the fender, feeling the smoothness of the paint and the solid construction beneath. A memory surfaced unbidden himself at 7 years old, standing on a milk crate in their garage, while his father showed him how to check the oil in their family car. His father's hands had been gentle and sure, guiding David's smaller hands to the dipstick, explaining the importance of regular maintenance and taking care of things that mattered. "Why?" David said aloud, his voice echoing in the warehouse. "Why this instead of us?" The cars offered no answers, only their silent testimony to years of solitary work. But as David continued to explore the collection, he began to notice other details. License plates from different states suggesting his father had traveled widely to find these cars. Restoration dates that spanned 3 decades, showing consistency and dedication. And in several vehicles, he found items that didn't belong to the restoration: a child's toy car in a glove compartment, newspaper clippings about high school graduations and sports achievements, photographs tucked behind visors. the photographs hit him hardest. Pictures of David at his own high school graduation, his wedding to Sarah, Emma as a baby. His father had been watching, somehow, documenting their lives from a distance while building this remarkable collection. David left the warehouse as the sun was setting, his mind reeling with questions and emotions he couldn't sort through. The brass key felt different in his pocket now, not just a tool, but a symbol of something larger and more complex than he had imagined. He drove home slowly, trying to process what he had discovered. The collection represented a fortune that could solve every financial problem he and Emma faced. College tuition would no longer be a worry. They could buy a house, start fresh, live without the constant stress of bills and overdue notices. But it also represented something else, a father who had cared enough to build something substantial, who had followed his son's life from afar, who had left behind a legacy that spoke of dedication and skill and love, even if that love had been expressed in ways David was only beginning to understand. David returned to the warehouse the next morning before work, drawn by questions that had kept him awake most of the night. In the daylight streaming through high windows, the collection looked even more impressive. He made his way directly to the work area, where he had noticed several restoration journals the day before. The first journal he picked up was labeled 1967 Mustang Fastback, Project 23. The cover was worn leather, soft from years of handling. Inside, his father's careful handwriting documented every step of the restoration process, complete with sketches, photographs, and detailed notes about parts, sources, and techniques. Day 1, acquired from estate sale in Michigan. Rust damage extensive on rear quarter panels, but frame is solid. Engine seized, transmission needs rebuild. Interior destroyed by weather, but all original chrome intact. David flipped through pages of meticulous documentation. His father had photographed every stage of the process, the car's arrival in rough condition, the careful disassembly, the painstaking restoration of each component. The attention to detail was extraordinary. Notes about paint codes, upholstery patterns, even the correct type of screws for specific panels. Day 89. Discovered original build sheet tucked behind rear seat. Car was built in Dearborn, shipped to dealer in Grand Rapids. Previous owner was a teacher, bought it new in 1967. Explains the careful maintenance despite the weather damage. As David read, he began to understand that his father hadn't just been restoring cars. He had been preserving history. Each vehicle represented someone's dreams, someone's careful savings, someone's pride and joy. His father had researched the provenance of every car, tracking down original specifications and maintaining authenticity with almost obsessive precision. Day 156, found original sales receipt in glove box. 592 new. Previous owner kept every maintenance record. She loved this car. We'll make sure restoration honors that love. The personal touches in the documentation surprised David. His father had clearly invested emotionally in each restoration, seeing himself as a steward rather than just a mechanic. Comments about previous owners, speculation about the car's history, even observations about design choices that revealed deep appreciation for automotive craftsmanship. David found the actual 1967 Mustang, 3 rows over a fastback in Highland green with black racing stripes. According to the journal, the restoration had taken nearly 2 years to complete. The result was stunning, a car that looked like it had been frozen in time since 1967. He opened the driver's door and slid behind the wheel, inhaling the scent of new leather and fresh paint. The interior was perfect, from the wood-grain steering wheel to the original AM/FM radio. His father had even found the correct floor mats and installed them with the same attention to detail, evident everywhere else. In the glove compartment, David found a small, wrapped package with his name written on it in his father's handwriting. Inside was a toy car, a red Hot Wheels 1967 Mustang that David vaguely remembered from his childhood. Attached was a note, "You always loved the red one best. I never forgot." The memory hit him with unexpected force. He had been maybe 8 years old, playing with Hot Wheels on the garage floor while his father worked on their family car. The red Mustang had been his favorite, and he had driven it along imaginary roads for hours, making engine noises and creating elaborate stories about racing adventures. David sat in the restored car, holding the toy and remembering the sound of his father's laughter when David had announced he wanted to build real cars someday. It had been one of those perfect childhood moments, before everything had changed, before the fights and the drinking and the final departure. He explored more of the warehouse, finding restoration journals for dozens of other vehicles. Each one told a story, not just of the car's restoration, but of his father's growing skill and deepening passion for the work. The early projects showed learning curves and mistakes. Later journals revealed mastery and confidence. 1973 Camaro Z28, Project 7, made mistake with paint mix, too much metallic, will have to strip and start over. Patience is everything in this work. 1969 Dodge Charger R, T3, Project 34, finally mastered the art of color sanding. 3 months of practice paying off. The patience David's mother always said I lacked, finding it here. The mention of his mother stopped David cold. He flipped through more pages, finding occasional references to his family scattered throughout the journals like breadcrumbs. 1956 Chevrolet Bel Air, Project 41. David graduated high school today. Saw the ceremony from across the street. He looks so much like his mother. Proud of the man he's becoming, even if I can't tell him. 1971 Plymouth Cuda, Project 52. David got married today. Beautiful ceremony. Sarah seems like a wonderful girl. Found myself thinking about the garage we used to share, teaching him about engines. Maybe someday he'll understand why I had to leave. David's hands trembled as he read entry after entry, documenting milestones in his life that his father had witnessed from a distance. High school graduation, wedding, Emma's birth moments, when David had looked around, unconsciously hoping to see his father's face in the crowd, only to be disappointed by his absence. But he hadn't been absent. He had been there, watching, caring, documenting David's life in the margins of restoration journals, as if these cars were the only place he felt safe, expressing his love. The most painful entry came in the journal for a 1955 Ford Thunderbird. Project 67. David's wife died today. Cancer. Wanted to go to him, to help somehow, but what right do I have? Been gone too long, hurt them too much. Best thing I can do is stay away and let him grieve without my complications. But my heart is breaking for him and little Emma. David closed the journal and leaned against the workbench, overwhelmed by the revelation that his father had shared their grief from afar. All those years when David had felt abandoned and alone, his father had been carrying his own burden of separation and regret. Emma found him there that evening when she came looking for him after he missed dinner. David had lost track of time, absorbed in reading journal after journal, piecing together a picture of his father that contradicted everything he thought he knew. "Dad, your boss called the house. He said you never showed up for work today." Emma looked around the warehouse with wide eyes. "This is incredible. Grandpa did all this?" David nodded, holding up one of the journals. 30 years worth. Every car documented, every restoration planned and executed with more care than I've ever seen. Emma walked among the cars, trailing her fingers along polished chrome and perfect paint. He was an artist. He was a lot of things, apparently. David's voice was rough with emotion, including someone who cared about us more than I ever knew. They spent the next hour exploring together, Emma reading over David's shoulder as he showed her the entries about their family. She was quiet for a long time after learning about her grandfather's distant presence at important moments in their lives. "Dad," she finally said, "maybe he didn't leave because he didn't love you. Maybe he left because he loved you too much to let his problems hurt you anymore." David looked at his daughter, struck by her wisdom and insight. At 17, she seemed to understand something about complex love and difficult choices that he was only beginning to grasp at 47. That night, David took the 1967 Mustang Journal home and read it cover to cover. By the time he finished, he realized that tomorrow he would have to make some decisions about the collection, about his father's legacy, and about what kind of inheritance he wanted to leave for Emma. The faded family photograph fell from the visor of a 1955 Chevrolet when David opened the driver's door 3 days later. It fluttered to the car's pristine seat like a leaf from another season, its edges soft with age and handling. David picked it up with careful fingers, his breath catching as he recognized the image. It was the three of them, David, at maybe 5 years old, flanked by his parents, at what appeared to be a car show. His father looked young and proud, one hand resting on David's shoulder, the other pointing toward a gleaming Corvette in the background. His mother was smiling, her hair styled in the fashion of the early 70s, her expression radiating happiness and contentment. But it was David himself in the photograph that struck him most powerfully. The little boy was beaming at the camera, holding a small trophy probably for some children's contest or participation award. His eyes were bright with excitement, and his stance mimicked his father's confident posture perfectly. David had no memory of this day, though something about the setting felt familiar in the way childhood experiences sometimes do, buried beneath years of harder memories. But here was evidence of a time when they had been a family, when car shows had been fun outings rather than symbols of his father's escape from responsibility. He sat in the Chevrolet's driver's seat, studying the photograph in the warehouse's fluorescent light. His parents looked so young, so hopeful. His father's face held none of the tension and frustration that David remembered from later years. Instead, Robert Morrison looked like a man enjoying a perfect day with his family. "Emma, come look at this," David called to his daughter, who was exploring a collection of motorcycles in a distant corner of the warehouse. She jogged over, her footsteps echoing in the vast space. Over the past week, she had become his partner in discovery, helping him catalog the collection and reading through the restoration journals with the kind of systematic approach that reminded David why she had gotten into Northwestern. "What did you find?" she asked, settling into the passenger seat beside him. David handed her the photograph. "I don't remember this day at all, but apparently we used to go to car shows together." Emma studied the image carefully. "You look exactly like me when I won that science fair in middle school." Same expression. She looked up at David. "Do you think he kept this all these years?" It was tucked behind the visor, could have been there since he restored the car, or he could have put it there recently. David took the photograph back, noting how the edges were worn smooth, suggesting it had been handled often. The journal for this car is from 15 years ago. They had established a routine over the past week. David would come to the warehouse before work and during his lunch breaks, while Emma joined him most evenings. They were slowly working through the collection systematically, reading the journals and learning about each car's history. The legal aspects were being handled by Thomas Harrison, who had proven to be not just his father's attorney, but also the trustee for a surprisingly complex estate. The cars were just the beginning, Harrison had explained. Robert Morrison had been more financially astute than David had ever imagined, investing the profits from his restoration work and building a portfolio that included rental properties, municipal bonds, and carefully chosen stocks. The total estate was worth more than David could process, but Harrison had been clear about one thing: it all belonged to David now. "The photograph makes me think about something," Emma said, interrupting David's thoughts. All week we've been learning about Grandpa's skill as a restorer, but we haven't talked much about why he chose this particular hobby. David considered her words. What do you mean? Well, cars are about movement, right? About going places, exploring, having adventures. But he collected them and kept them in one place. It's almost like he was preserving the possibility of journeys rather than actually taking them. Her insight struck David as particularly mature. Emma had always been observant, but lately she seemed to be seeing patterns and connections that escaped him. You think he was stuck somehow? Maybe. Or maybe he was afraid that if he actually went anywhere, he might not come back. So he kept all these symbols of freedom and adventure close by, where he could control them. David looked around the warehouse with new eyes. Seen from Emma's perspective, the collection did feel like a substitute for something else, not just cars, but dreams of escape that had never been realized. His father had spent 30 years surrounded by vehicles capable of taking him anywhere, yet he had remained rooted in this one place, tending to them like a shepherd, watching over his flock. There's something else I've been thinking about, Emma continued. All these restoration journals mention previous owners, right? People who loved these cars before Grandpa bought them. But I haven't seen any records of him selling cars to new owners. It's like he rescued them and then could never let them go. She was right. David had noticed the same pattern but hadn't articulated it to himself. His father seemed to have been a collector of stories as much as cars, preserving not just the vehicles but their emotional histories. The journals were full of speculation about previous owners, research into original buyers, even efforts to track down families who might want to know what had happened to a relative's beloved car. Project 58 1963 Ford Falcon wagon, David read from a journal they had reviewed the previous day, belonged to elderly woman in Phoenix, found her son's address, sent photos of completed restoration. He cried when he saw them, said his mother had driven them to school in this car every day for 10 years. He was preserving more than cars, Emma observed. He was preserving connections between people and their memories. David found himself wondering if his father had seen parallels between the cars and his relationship with his family. Had he viewed himself as preserving something precious from a distance, maintaining it carefully, but never allowing himself to enjoy it directly? They spent the evening in the warehouse, Emma reading journals aloud while David examined the cars they documented. The 1955 Chevrolet had been his father's first major restoration, undertaken just 2 years after he had left David's family. The journal entries from that period were sparse and focused strictly on technical details, as if emotions were too dangerous to document. But gradually, over the years, the journals had become more personal. References to David and his mother had appeared, tentative at first, then more frequent. By the time of the later restorations, his father had been documenting David's life milestones with the same careful attention he paid to paint codes and engine specifications. "Dad," Emma said, as they prepared to leave that evening, "I know this whole situation is complicated, but I think what we're discovering is beautiful. Grandpa found a way to love us even when he couldn't be with us." David locked the warehouse and pocketed the brass key, which had become a talisman of sorts. "Maybe, but it doesn't excuse the years of absence. You can't restore a relationship the way you restore a car." "Maybe not," Emma agreed. "But maybe understanding why he made the choices he did can help us heal from the damage they caused." As they drove home, David found himself thinking about the photograph and what it represented. Somewhere in his subconscious, he had memories of his father as a loving parent, even if those memories had been overshadowed by later pain. The man who had taken him to car shows and patiently taught him about engines was the same man who had spent 30 years meticulously restoring vehicles and documenting his family's life from afar. The question now was whether David could find a way to reconcile those two versions of his father, and whether doing so might help him understand how to be a better father himself. The letter was tucked behind the sun visor of a 1968 Camaro SS, folded so many times the creases had worn soft as fabric. David almost missed it entirely, but the corner of yellowed paper caught the light as he was examining the car's pristine interior. When he unfolded it, his father's handwriting filled both sides of the page, though the words ended abruptly halfway through a sentence, as if the writer had stopped mid-thought and never returned. "Dear David," it began, and David's hands trembled as he read on. "I know I have no right to write to you after all these years, no right to expect forgiveness or understanding. But sitting here tonight, working on this Camaro that reminds me so much of the car I promised to buy you for your 16th birthday, the promise I broke along with so many others, I find myself needing to try to explain what I've never been able to say. Person, I didn't leave because I stopped loving you and your mother. I left because I loved you too much to keep destroying your lives with my problems. You were 14, old enough to see what the drinking was doing to our family, old enough to hear the fights, even when we tried to keep them quiet. Your mother deserved better than a husband who found more solace in a bottle than in his family's arms. You deserved a father who could be present, reliable, someone you could look up to, instead of someone whose problems overshadowed your accomplishments. The night I decided to leave, I found you in the garage, working on that model airplane we had started together. You looked up at me with such hope, asking when we could finish it, and I realized I had been disappointing you for months. Every promise broken, every evening spent at Murphy's bar instead of helping with homework, every time I chose my own pain over your needs. The look in your eyes when I said, maybe tomorrow for the 100th time, I knew I was failing you in ways that would mark you forever. I thought if I left, you could have a chance at a normal life. Your mother could find someone better, someone who wouldn't bring chaos and unpredictability into your world. You could grow up without the constant tension, without walking on eggshells around your father's moods. I told myself it was a sacrifice, that leaving was the most loving thing I could do. But I've watched you from a distance all these years, and I see now how wrong I was. I see the man you've become: strong, responsible, devoted to Emma in ways I never learned to be devoted to you. You've been everything I couldn't be, and that fills me with both pride and regret. Pride because you broke the cycle. Regret because I wasn't there to witness your growth or to tell you how proud I am. I know about Sarah's death. I know about the struggles you faced as a single father, the bills and the worry and the weight of responsibility I left you to carry alone. I've wanted to help 1,000 times, wanted to reach out and offer support, but what right did I have? What comfort could come from the man who taught you that fathers leave when things get difficult? These cars have become my way of building something for you, something that might someday prove that not everything I touched turned to disappointment. Each restoration is an apology. I don't know how to speak. Each perfect detail, an attempt to show you the kind of care and attention I should have given to our relationship. I know it's not enough, will never be enough, but it's all I. The letter ended there, the sentence incomplete, the page showing signs of water damage that might have been tears. David sat in the Camaro, reading and rereading the words, feeling 30 years of anger and abandonment slowly giving way to something more complex and harder to categorize. His father had been carrying his own burden of regret all these years, building this collection not as an escape from family responsibility, but as a monument to it. Every car represented an attempt to create something worthy of the son he had felt unworthy to raise. Emma found him there an hour later, still sitting in the Camaro with the letter in his hands. She slid into the passenger seat without speaking, immediately sensing the gravity of whatever he had discovered. "He wrote me a letter," David said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "Never finished it, never sent it. But he wrote it." Emma read the letter carefully, her expression growing more thoughtful with each paragraph. When she finished, she folded it gently and handed it back to her father. "He sounds like he was in a lot of pain. He was an alcoholic, Emma. I remember the drinking, the fights with your grandmother. He's right about that part. Things were bad toward the end. David stared through the Camaro's windshield at the rows of restored cars. But I always thought he left because he didn't care enough to try. I never considered that he might have left because he cared too much to keep hurting us. Both things can be true, Emma said gently. He could have loved you and still made the wrong choice. Love doesn't always make people wise. David thought about his own parenting, the mistakes he had made with Emma, the times he had been too tired or stressed to be the father she deserved. He had never considered leaving, but he understood the fear his father described, the terror of damaging the person you love most through your own inadequacies. The letter talks about Sarah, David continued. He knew about her death, about our struggles. He's been watching our lives all this time. That must be why he documented so much in the journals, Emma observed. All those references to your graduation, my birth, Mom's funeral. He was trying to be part of our lives in the only way he felt he could. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, processing the revelation together. David found himself remembering moments from his childhood with new context, his father's gentleness when teaching him about cars, the pride in his voice when David mastered a new skill, the way he had seemed happiest in the garage working on projects together. There's something else, Emma said eventually. The restoration journals we've been reading, they're not just technical documentation, they're love letters. Every car he saved, every detail he perfected, it was all for you. This whole collection is 30 years of love that he didn't know how to express any other way. David looked around the warehouse, seeing it through Emma's eyes. His father had spent 3 decades building this legacy, not as a replacement for family, but as a gift to the family he had felt he couldn't deserve. Every pristine restoration, every careful documentation, every preserved memory was an act of love performed in solitude. I'm still angry, David admitted. Even understanding his reasons, I'm angry that he took the choice away from us. Maybe we could have worked through his problems together. Maybe leaving wasn't the only option. Maybe not, Emma agreed. But he was doing the best he could with what he knew at the time. And look what he left us, not just the cars and the money, but the knowledge that he never stopped loving us. That counts for something. David folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his jacket pocket, next to the brass key that had started this journey. Tomorrow he would have to make decisions about the collection, about his father's legacy, about what to do with this inheritance of love and regret. But tonight, he was content to sit with his daughter in a perfectly restored car, understanding for the first time that he had never been as alone as he had thought. The father who had left him at 14 had never really left at all. He had simply found a different way to stay, building something beautiful and lasting that would survive long after his own regrets had been laid to rest. The manila envelope was wedged between the seat cushions of a 1959 Cadillac Eldorado, as if someone had sat down quickly and forgotten about the documents they were carrying. Inside, David found his parents' marriage certificate from 1969, yellowed with age, but still clearly legible. Beneath it, clipped together with a paperclip that had left rust stains, were divorce papers dated 6 months after his father had left home. The divorce papers had never been filed. David stared at the unsigned documents, his mind struggling to process what this meant. His father had prepared for divorce, had gone through the legal process of dissolution, but had never taken the final step of actually ending the marriage. For 30 years, until his mother's death, Robert Morrison had remained legally married to the woman he had abandoned. Emma found him in the Cadillac's luxurious interior, the documents spread across the pristine leather seats. "Dad? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I have." David handed her the marriage certificate and divorce papers. "Your grandmother and grandfather were never actually divorced." Emma examined the documents carefully, her expression growing more puzzled as she read. "But why would he prepare the papers and not file them? That doesn't make sense." "Unless he always intended to come back," David said slowly, the realization forming as he spoke the words. "Maybe he thought the separation would be temporary, that he could get his life together and return to us." Emma studied the papers more closely. The divorce papers are dated 6 months after he left. But look at this. There are notes in the margins in his handwriting. Custody arrangements, visitation schedule, things like that. He was thinking about how to maintain a relationship with you, even if the marriage ended. David looked at the marginal notes his daughter was pointing out. His father's handwriting filled the spaces around the legal text with what appeared to be a father's attempt to negotiate the terms of his own exile. Every other weekend, one note read, summer vacation 2 weeks minimum. Another notation suggested Christmas morning David should wake up at home. He was trying to figure out how to be part-time, David realized, but something must have changed his mind. They searched through the other documents in the envelope, finding medical records, bank statements, and what appeared to be correspondence with a treatment facility. The medical records painted a picture of a man struggling with alcoholism who had sought professional help multiple times during the years following his departure. "Look at this," Emma said, holding up a letter from Riverside Treatment Center dated 2 years after his father had left. He completed a 60-day inpatient program. There's a certificate of completion and everything. David read the letter, which congratulated his father on his commitment to sobriety and outlined a continuing care plan. But there were other documents too, records of relapses, additional treatment attempts, a pattern of struggle that extended for several years after he had left the family. He was trying to get well, David said, understanding dawning. All those years I thought he had just walked away and started over somewhere else. He was actually fighting to become someone worthy of coming home to. Emma found a journal entry tucked among the medical records, written in her grandfather's increasingly shaky handwriting. Year 3, day 847, sober. Dr. Martinez says, I'm ready to consider rebuilding relationships, but every time I think about calling David, I lose my nerve. What do I say? Sorry, I've been gone for 3 years getting my life together. He's 17 now, has learned to be the man of the house. Margaret has managed everything without me. Maybe the kindest thing is to let them continue believing I simply left. Maybe coming back now would only disrupt the stability they've found. David's throat tightened as he read his father's words. At 17, he had indeed taken on adult responsibilities, helping his mother with bills and household repairs, working part-time to contribute to family expenses. He had been proud of his independence, of his ability to fill the void his father had left. But reading this now, he realized his father had been watching and misinterpreting his growth as evidence that he was no longer needed or wanted. The timing is heartbreaking, Emma observed. Right when he was getting healthy enough to come back, he convinced himself you were better off without him. They found more evidence of his father's internal struggle throughout the documents. Letters drafted but never sent, birthday cards addressed but never mailed, even a rental application for an apartment closer to their neighborhood that had been completed but never submitted. He drove by the house, David said, reading from another journal entry. Every year on my birthday, he would drive by to see if we were okay. There's a whole entry here about my 18th birthday party, describing the decorations Mom put up, the friends who came over. He was there, watching from the street. Emma shook her head sadly. All those years when you felt abandoned, he was actually closer than you knew, just too afraid to close the distance. The most devastating discovery came in the form of newspaper clippings at the bottom of the envelope. His mother's obituary, carefully cut from the local paper and preserved between sheets of tissue paper. Written in the margin, in his father's handwriting, were the words, "Too late, always too late." He was at Mom's funeral, David said, his voice barely above a whisper. Harrison mentioned that the anonymous flowers came from him. He was there, watching us grieve, carrying his own grief alone. Emma reached over and squeezed her father's hand. That must have been when he gave up on the idea of reconciliation, when he realized that waiting for the right moment meant missing all the moments that mattered. David thought about the years following his mother's death, the struggle of single parenthood, the nights when he had felt completely alone in the world. His father had been carrying his own burden of isolation during that same period, watching his family suffer from a distance and blaming himself for their pain. "The car collection," David said suddenly. "Most of the major restorations started after Mom died. Look at the dates in the journals. Almost everything we've seen was completed in the last 8 years." Emma nodded, understanding. He threw himself into the work after Grandma died. All that love and regret had to go somewhere. They sat in the Cadillac as the warehouse lights cast long shadows among the classic cars. The collection now felt different to David, less like a hobby and more like a monument to missed opportunities and unexpressed love. His father had spent the final years of his life building something beautiful to leave behind, knowing he had forfeited his right to give it in person. "I understand him better now," David said finally. "But understanding doesn't erase 30 years of his absence. It doesn't give me back the guidance I needed as a teenager or the grandfather Emma deserved to know." "No, it doesn't," Emma agreed. "But maybe it gives us something else. Maybe it helps us forgive him, and maybe more importantly, it helps us forgive ourselves for all the anger we've carried." David looked at his daughter, struck again by her wisdom and emotional maturity. At 17, she was already more insightful about human nature than he had been at 30. "When did you get so wise?" "I had a good teacher," she said, smiling. "A father who stayed and fought through the hard times instead of running away. Grandpa may have given me his genes, but you gave me everything that really matters." As they prepared to leave the warehouse that evening, David carefully returned the marriage certificate and divorce papers to their envelope. Tomorrow, Thomas Harrison would help him understand the full legal implications of his inheritance. But tonight, he was beginning to understand the emotional inheritance his father had left, not just wealth and classic cars, but a lesson about the difference between love and presence, between caring and courage, between good intentions and the hard work of actually showing up. His father had loved them enough to leave, but not enough to stay and fight for the family he was trying to protect. It was a distinction that would shape how David thought about his own challenges and choices for the rest of his life. The hidden safe was discovered purely by accident. David had been examining a 1970 Plymouth Barracuda when he noticed the workbench beside it seemed oddly positioned too far from the wall, creating an awkward gap that didn't match his father's otherwise efficient use of space. When he moved the heavy bench, he found a section of the warehouse wall that looked different from the rest. Newer somehow, with barely visible seams marking what appeared to be a false panel. The panel swung open to reveal a safe the size of a small closet, its door standing slightly ajar, as if someone had been interrupted while closing it. Inside, David found filing cabinets, document boxes, and banker's boxes stacked with military precision. But it was the computer sitting on a small desk inside the safe that surprised him most, a modern laptop that looked completely out of place among his father's analog restoration tools. Emma peered over his shoulder as he powered on the computer. "Grandpa wasn't exactly the tech type, was he?" "Not that I knew of," David replied, watching the screen come to life. The desktop was organized with the same meticulous attention to detail evident in the restoration journals. Folders labeled by year, spreadsheets tracking expenses and income, and what appeared to be a comprehensive database of every car in the collection. But as David explored deeper into the files, he discovered something that made his understanding of his father's life shift dramatically. The car collection was just one part of a much larger financial operation. His father had been buying and selling classic cars for 3 decades, using the profits to invest in rental properties, municipal bonds, and carefully chosen stocks. "Look at this spreadsheet," Emma said, pointing to a file labeled Investment Portfolio, Current. The numbers were staggering. Real estate holdings worth several $1,000,000, a stock portfolio that had grown steadily over 30 years, and liquid assets that dwarfed anything David had imagined possible. He was a businessman, David said, scrolling through transaction records that showed a level of financial sophistication he had never associated with his father. All this time, I thought he was just a mechanic who liked old cars. Emma opened one of the filing cabinets and found folders containing property deeds, stock certificates, and business partnerships. "Dad, look at this." He owned apartment buildings in 3 different cities. He was a silent partner in several auto restoration shops. This wasn't a hobby, it was an empire. David found a leather-bound ledger that documented his father's business evolution. The early entries showed small profits from individual car sales, but over time, the operation had grown more sophisticated. His father had identified undervalued classic cars, restored them to perfection, and sold them to collectors and museums for substantial profits. The proceeds had been systematically invested, creating multiple income streams that compounded over decades. He was protecting us, David realized, reading through correspondence with financial advisors and estate planners. All of this, the cars, the investments, the business partnerships, it was all set up to provide security for his family. Emma found a business plan dated just 5 years earlier, outlining his father's strategy for the final phase of his investment program. The plan called for liquidating certain assets and consolidating others to create a more manageable inheritance. The target amount for the final estate was precisely calculated to cover Emma's college education, David's early retirement, and comfortable living expenses for both of them for the rest of their lives. "He planned everything," Emma said, her voice filled with wonder. "Down to my college tuition and your retirement savings. He knew exactly what we would need." David discovered files containing detailed research about Emma's academic interests, scholarship opportunities, and career prospects. His father had been tracking her achievements not just as a proud grandfather, but as a strategic planner, ensuring her future success. There were even preliminary contact notes with Northwestern University's development office, suggesting his father had been considering making a donation to secure Emma's admission. The timing of his death, David said, a chill running through him, the will specifying that I had to wait 24 hours before Harrison could contact me. He planned the whole sequence. Emma looked up from a file she was reading. "What do you mean?" "He knew he was sick. Look at these medical records. He'd been having heart problems for months. The doctor told him he could have another attack at any time." David found the relevant documents, his hands shaking slightly. He orchestrated his own estate transfer, right down to the timing. The revelation was overwhelming. His father hadn't just left him a collection of cars and some money. He had spent 30 years building a financial foundation specifically designed to give David and Emma the freedom he had never allowed himself to have. Every business decision, every investment, every calculated risk had been made with his family's future in mind. "But why the secrecy?" Emma asked. "Why not just tell you what he was doing? Why make you think he was just an absent father instead of someone working to secure your future?" David found the answer in a file labeled "Personal, do not open until after." Inside was a video file on a USB drive and a letter explaining his father's reasoning. The letter was brief but clear. "David will only appreciate this inheritance if he discovers it gradually. If he understands the work and dedication that went into building it. If I simply give him money, it will feel like charity or guilt payment. But if he sees the cars first, understands the craftsmanship and patience required for restoration, then he will appreciate that this entire enterprise was built on the same principles: careful planning, attention to detail, and love for the final result." Emma plugged the USB drive into the computer, and David's father appeared on screen, looking older and more frail than David remembered, but with eyes that held the same intelligence and determination David recognized from his childhood. "If you're watching this, it means you've found the safe and discovered the truth about what I've been doing all these years," his father said from the screen. "I know you probably have questions about why I kept this secret, why I didn't just reach out and explain what I was trying to accomplish." David felt Emma's hand slip into his as they watched his father's final message. "The truth is, I was ashamed, ashamed that I had left you to struggle while I was building wealth, ashamed that I was a better investor than I was a father, ashamed that I could show more patience and dedication to restoring cars than I ever showed to repairing our relationship. His father paused on screen, gathering his thoughts. But I also knew that coming back into your life would have complicated everything you had built without me. You didn't need my money when you were learning to be independent. You needed to discover your own strength, your own capability. What you needed from me was the security of knowing that if you ever fell, there would be something to catch you. David realized he was crying, something he hadn't done since Sarah's funeral. The car collection was my way of showing you that I understood quality, that I could build something worthy of respect. The investments were my way of ensuring that you and Emma would never have to worry about money the way I worried about it when you were growing up. And this message is my way of telling you that every day I stayed away was a day I spent thinking about you, planning for you, and loving you from a distance. The video continued for another 10 minutes, with his father explaining the details of various investments and providing passwords for accounts David hadn't known existed. But the most important part came at the end. David, you have become exactly the man I hoped you would become, despite my failures as your father. Emma is extraordinary because of the parent you've been, not because of anything I contributed. This inheritance isn't meant to change who you are, it's meant to give you the freedom to be more of who you already are. When the video ended, David and Emma sat in silence in the hidden room behind the warehouse wall. Around them, documents and files represented a 30-year effort to build something lasting and meaningful. His father had been playing a longer game than David had ever imagined, sacrificing immediate gratification and relationship for the sake of long-term security and legacy. Dad, Emma said softly, I think Grandpa was the most patient man who ever lived. 30 years of planning for a moment he wouldn't be alive to see. David looked around the room at the evidence of his father's secret life, understanding finally that the man who had seemed to abandon his family had actually spent every day of his absence working for their benefit. It was both the most loving and most heartbreaking discovery he could have imagined. Thomas Harrison had been expecting David's call, but the urgency in his voice suggested the discovery of the hidden safe had accelerated the timeline for decisions that could no longer be postponed. They met the next morning in Harrison's office, the same room where David had first learned about his $1 inheritance 2 weeks earlier. Now the polished conference table was covered with documents that represented a fortune beyond anything David had imagined possible. Your father was quite specific about this phase of the inheritance process, Harrison explained, opening a thick folder marked Final Instructions. He anticipated that discovering the full scope of his estate would be overwhelming, so he prepared detailed guidance for your next steps. David studied the documents spread before him. Property deeds for apartment buildings in 3 states, stock certificates representing decades of careful investment, bank statements showing liquid assets that exceeded the value of the entire car collection. The numbers were staggering, but what struck him most was the meticulous organization of everything his father had built. The car collection alone is valued at approximately $8 million, Harrison continued. But that represents less than 20% of the total estate. Your father's real genius was in recognizing that classic cars were just the beginning, not the end. Emma, who had insisted on attending this meeting despite David's initial reluctance to burden her with adult financial concerns, spoke up from her chair beside him. He was using the cars as both a passion and a business strategy. Exactly, Harrison confirmed. He would identify undervalued vehicles, restore them to museum quality, then sell strategically to fund other investments. The cars you see in the warehouse now are the ones he chose to keep, either because they had personal significance or because he believed their value would continue to appreciate. David found himself thinking about the 1967 Mustang his father had documented so carefully in the Restoration Journal. The fastback he restored that was never meant to be sold, was it? Harrison smiled. That car was specifically restored for you. Your father researched your birth year, your early interests, even your favorite colors from when you were a child. Every detail of that restoration was chosen with you in mind. The revelation hit David unexpectedly hard. While he had been learning to change oil and fix transmissions at Murphy's Auto Repair, his father had been creating a masterpiece designed to reconnect them through their shared love of automotive craftsmanship. "There's something else," Harrison said, producing another folder. "Your father left specific instructions about potential buyers for the collection. He anticipated that you might want to liquidate some assets. So he cultivated relationships with collectors and museums who would appreciate what he built." David opened the folder to find correspondence with automotive museums across the country, private collectors who had been following his father's work for years, and even inquiries from movie studios looking for authentic vehicles for period films. His father had created a market for his own collection, ensuring that David would have options when the time came to make decisions. "But there's a condition," Harrison continued, his tone becoming more serious. "Your father was very clear that any decision about the collection should be made thoughtfully, with full understanding of what you would be preserving or giving up. He wanted you to take time, to really comprehend the scope of what he built." Emma leaned forward. "What kind of time frame are we talking about?" "He suggested a minimum of 6 months," Harrison replied. "Time enough to really explore the collection, understand the business aspects, and decide whether you want to continue his work or pursue a different path." David felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. His father hadn't just left him wealth, he had left him a legacy that represented 3 decades of careful planning and execution. The decision about what to do with it felt enormous. "There's also this," Harrison said, producing a sealed envelope marked to be opened only after discovery of the complete estate. Inside, David found another letter in his father's careful handwriting. "David, if you're reading this, you now understand the full scope of what I spent 30 years building. You may be feeling overwhelmed, angry, or grateful, probably all 3. That's exactly what I expected. I want you to know that this inheritance comes with no obligations except one. Whatever you decide to do with it should honor both your own values and the future you want to create for Emma. I built this for your freedom, not to trap you in my vision of what your life should be. But I also want you to know that this collection and these investments represent more than money. They represent proof that patience and dedication can create something lasting and beautiful. They represent the possibility that work done with love, even in solitude, can have meaning beyond the worker's lifetime. If you choose to sell everything and start fresh, I will understand. If you choose to continue the restoration work, I have left you the knowledge and connections to succeed. If you choose something entirely different, I trust your judgment more than you know. The one thing I ask is that you make whatever choice feels truest to who you are as a man and as a father. Don't let guilt or obligation drive your decision. Let love drive it, love for Emma, love for the life you want to build together, and perhaps even love for the imperfect father who spent 3 decades trying to make amends for the mistakes of 1 difficult year." David set the letter down, his hands shaking slightly. Around him, the office felt charged with possibility and responsibility in equal measure. "Dad," Emma said softly, "what are you thinking?" David looked at his daughter, seeing in her face the same intelligence and determination that had driven his father's long-term planning. "I'm thinking that your grandfather spent 30 years building something remarkable, and that we need to understand it completely before we decide what to do with it." Over the next several days, David and Emma threw themselves into learning every aspect of the inheritance. They met with the property managers who oversaw his father's rental buildings. They consulted with the financial advisors who had helped guide his investment strategy. They spent hours in the warehouse, not just admiring the cars, but understanding the business model that had made the collection possible. David began working on the 1967 Mustang, following his father's restoration notes and finding a kind of meditation in the careful, precise work. Each evening, Emma would join him, reading aloud from the journals while he worked on the engine or interior details. The rhythm of the work, the satisfaction of bringing something beautiful back to life, began to make sense in ways David hadn't expected. "You know what I think," Emma said one evening as David adjusted the carburetor on the Mustang. "I think Grandpa was teaching you something about patience and long-term thinking. All these years, you've been focused on immediate problems, paying this month's rent, fixing this week's car, getting through today's challenges. But he was thinking in decades." David paused in his work, considering her words. "You think he wanted me to learn to think bigger?" "I think he wanted you to understand that you could afford to think bigger, that you didn't have to live from paycheck to paycheck anymore, always worried about the next crisis." Emma handed him a wrench. "But I also think he wanted you to choose that bigger thinking for yourself, not just inherit it." That night, David sat in the warehouse office his father had created, surrounded by restoration journals and business records. For the first time in his adult life, he had the luxury of thinking beyond immediate necessity. Emma's college tuition was no longer a source of anxiety. It was already funded several times over. His own retirement was secure, whether he continued working at Murphy's or chose a different path entirely. But with that freedom came a different kind of pressure. The pressure to make choices that honored both the gift his father had given him and the values he wanted to pass on to Emma. His father had spent 30 years building something meaningful. The question now was whether David had the vision and courage to decide what that something should become. The upcoming classic car show in the city had been circled on his father's calendar for months. David realized it was meant to be a debut, not just for the 1967 Mustang he was restoring, but for David himself, as the heir to his father's legacy. It would be his first public appearance as Robert Morrison's son, his first opportunity to step into the community his father had built around classic car restoration. The thought terrified and excited him in equal measure. In less than a month, he would have to decide not just what to do with his inheritance, but who he wanted to become with it. The morning of the classic car show dawned clear and bright, with the kind of perfect autumn weather that made every color seem more vivid, and every chrome detail sparkle like jewelry. David stood in the warehouse at 6 a.m., making final adjustments to the 1967 Mustang Fastback that had consumed his evenings for the past month. The Highland green paint gleamed under the fluorescent lights, and the black racing stripes drew perfect lines from hood to trunk. Emma appeared beside him, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the kind of excited expression she usually reserved for Christmas morning. "Dad, it's beautiful. Grandpa would be so proud." David accepted the coffee gratefully, his hands still trembling slightly with nervous energy. The restoration had been more challenging than he had anticipated, requiring skills he hadn't used since trade school and patience he wasn't sure he possessed. But following his father's meticulous notes had been like having a master craftsman guiding his hands, and the result exceeded anything he had imagined possible. "I've been thinking about what to say," David admitted, running his hand along the Mustang's perfect fender. "People are going to want to know about your grandfather, about his work, about what happens to the collection next." "Just speak from the heart," Emma advised. "Tell them what you've learned about him, what the cars meant to him, what they mean to you now." David nodded, though his stomach was tight with anxiety. The classic car show wasn't just a display event, it was a community gathering where relationships were built and reputations established. His father had been respected in this world for 3 decades, and David was about to make his debut as Robert Morrison's son. They loaded the Mustang onto the transport trailer David had rented, securing it with the same careful attention his father would have demanded. The drive to the showgrounds took 40 minutes, giving David time to rehearse what he might say to the collectors, enthusiasts, and museum curators who had known his father's work. The showgrounds were already bustling with activity when they arrived. Hundreds of classic cars were being positioned in neat rows, their owners fussing over final details and setting up display materials. David felt overwhelmed by the scale and sophistication of the event, but Emma's steady presence beside him helped calm his nerves. "Robert Morrison's son," a voice called out as David was unloading the Mustang. He turned to see a distinguished gentleman in his 70s, approaching with obvious excitement. "I'm Harold Pearson from the Automotive Heritage Museum. Your father and I corresponded for years, but I never had the pleasure of meeting you." David shook Pearson's offered hand, surprised by the warmth in the older man's greeting. "I'm David Morrison. This is my daughter Emma." "That fastback is one of your father's masterpieces," Pearson said, walking around the car with the expert eye of someone who understood automotive perfection. He documented the entire restoration process for our museum archives. The work is absolutely flawless. Other enthusiasts began gathering around the Mustang, and David found himself at the center of conversations about restoration techniques, parts sourcing, and his father's legendary attention to detail. Each person had stories about Robert Morrison, his generosity in sharing knowledge, his willingness to help other restorers find rare parts, his reputation for integrity in all his business dealings. "Your father sold me a 1963 split-window Corvette 15 years ago," said a woman named Martha Chen. "It was the most honest transaction I've ever experienced. He could have gotten 20,000 more from another buyer, but he said the car belonged with someone who would drive it and enjoy it, not just store it in a climate-controlled garage." As the morning progressed, David began to understand that his father had been more than just a skilled restorer. He had been a pillar of the classic car community, someone whose opinion was sought and whose work was universally respected. The collection in the warehouse wasn't just his personal hobby. It was part of a larger network of people who shared his passion for automotive history and craftsmanship. "Mr. Morrison," a younger man approached nervously. "I'm Jake Sullivan. I've been following your father's work since I was in high school. His restoration journals taught me everything I know about proper bodywork. I just wanted to say thank you." David felt a surge of pride mixed with sadness. His father had been teaching and inspiring people for decades, sharing his knowledge freely and building a community around shared passion. All of this had been happening while David was carrying resentment about his father's absence from family gatherings and school events. The moment came when the show organizers called for the featured presentation. David had agreed to speak about his father's work and the future of the collection, though he still wasn't entirely sure what he was going to say. Emma squeezed his hand as they walked to the microphone that had been set up beside the Mustang. The crowd that gathered was larger than David had expected, easily 100 people, ranging from teenagers fascinated by classic cars to elderly collectors who had known his father personally. David looked out at their expectant faces and felt the weight of representing not just his own feelings, but his father's legacy and reputation. "My name is David Morrison," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd. "This 1967 Mustang Fastback represents the last restoration my father completed before his death 6 weeks ago. For most of my adult life, I thought I didn't really know Robert Morrison. Today, I want to share what I've learned about the man who built something remarkable not just for himself, but for all of us who love these machines and the history they represent." David's voice grew stronger as he continued, the crowd's attentive silence giving him confidence. 6 weeks ago, I inherited what I thought was an insult, a single dollar from a father who had been absent from my life for 30 years. Today, I stand before you, having discovered not just a collection of beautifully restored vehicles, but a legacy of patience, dedication, and love that I'm only beginning to understand. He gestured toward the Mustang behind him, its Highland green paint gleaming in the afternoon sun. This car was restored specifically for me, though I didn't know it at the time. Every detail, the color, the interior, even the racing stripes was chosen based on my father's memories of what I loved as a child. It took me 3 decades to receive this gift, but I'm beginning to understand that the waiting was part of the gift itself. Emma stood at the edge of the crowd, beaming with pride as her father found his voice and his confidence. The transformation from the bitter, overwhelmed man who had crumpled up a will 6 weeks earlier was remarkable to witness. "Many of you knew my father better than I did," David continued. "You understood his commitment to preserving automotive history, his generosity in sharing knowledge, his integrity in every transaction. What I've learned is that these same qualities defined how he approached his family relationships, with patience, with long-term thinking, and with a love that expressed itself through action rather than words." Harold Pearson stepped forward from the crowd. "David, I wonder if you could tell us about your plans for the collection. The museum community has tremendous respect for your father's work." David had been dreading this question, but now he found he was ready to answer it. "The collection will continue, but it will evolve. I've spent the last month learning my father's restoration techniques, studying his business model, and understanding his vision. What I've decided is that preserving these cars isn't enough. We need to preserve the knowledge and skills that make restoration possible." He pulled out a folder from the portfolio Emma was holding and opened it to reveal architectural drawings and business plans. "I'm announcing today the establishment of the Robert Morrison Restoration Institute. The warehouse that houses my father's collection will be expanded to include workshop space for teaching restoration techniques to a new generation of craftsmen." The crowd murmured with interest and approval. David continued, feeling more confident with each word. "We'll partner with the local community college to offer certification programs in classic car restoration. We'll host workshops for amateur enthusiasts and advanced seminars for professional restorers. Most importantly, we'll ensure that the skills my father spent 30 years perfecting aren't lost when my generation passes on." Martha Chen raised her hand. "Will you be keeping the collection intact?" "The core collection will remain as a teaching resource and museum," David replied. "But some vehicles will be sold to fund the educational programs and to make room for new projects. My father always believed that cars were meant to be driven and enjoyed, not just preserved under dust covers." Jake Sullivan, the young enthusiast who had approached David earlier, stepped forward excitedly. "Would there be apprenticeship opportunities? I've been dreaming of learning proper restoration techniques, but couldn't afford the private schools." "That's exactly what we're planning," David confirmed. "Full scholarships for promising students who show both aptitude and passion for the work. My father came from modest means and learned through mentorship and hard work. We want to provide that same opportunity to others." Emma moved to stand beside her father, and David put his arm around her shoulders. "My daughter Emma will be managing the business aspects of the institute while pursuing her engineering degree. She's already shown remarkable insight into my father's long-term planning strategies." "Dad," Emma said softly, just loud enough for the microphone to pick up, "I think Grandpa would be amazed by what you're creating. You're taking his individual passion and turning it into something that will help hundreds of people." David looked out at the crowd, seeing faces that reflected excitement, approval, and shared enthusiasm for preserving automotive history. "My father spent 30 years working alone, building something beautiful in isolation. What we're going to do is take that foundation and create community around it. We're going to teach and learn together, sharing the joy of bringing these machines back to life." Harold Pearson approached the microphone. "On behalf of the automotive restoration community, I want to say how excited we are about this vision. Your father would be incredibly proud of what you're planning." As the crowd began to disperse, individuals approached David with specific questions, offers of partnership, and expressions of support. Museum curators wanted to discuss loan programs. Restoration shop owners offered to provide specialized training modules. Young people inquired about application processes for the scholarship programs David had outlined. Emma worked beside him, collecting contact information and taking notes about potential partnerships. Her organizational skills and natural diplomatic manner made her an ideal liaison between David's vision and the practical details of making it reality. Mr. Morrison, an elderly gentleman, introduced himself as Frank Castellano. I owned a restoration shop for 40 years before I retired. Your father bought several cars from me over the years, and I always admired his dedication to authenticity. I'd like to volunteer to teach bodywork classes at your institute. Similar offers came from other professionals in the crowd. A retired upholsterer wanted to teach interior restoration. A master mechanic offered to lead engine rebuilding workshops. An automotive painter proposed advanced seminars on color matching and finish techniques. David realized that his father had not just built a collection and a fortune. He had built relationships with people who shared his passion and were eager to pass their knowledge on to others. The community was already there, waiting for someone to provide the structure and resources to make education possible. As the afternoon wound down, David found himself standing beside the Mustang with Emma, watching the last of the show participants load their cars for the journey home. The day had transformed his understanding of what inheritance could mean. It wasn't just about receiving something from the past, it was about taking responsibility for carrying something valuable into the future. "Dad," Emma said, "I think today was the day you really became Grandpa's son, not just biologically, but in terms of understanding what he was trying to build and why it mattered." David nodded, feeling a sense of completion that had been missing since his father's death. The anger and resentment he had carried for 30 years hadn't disappeared entirely, but they had been transformed into something more constructive, a determination to honor his father's legacy while creating something even better. 6 months later, David stood in the expanded warehouse space, watching Jake Sullivan carefully sand the fender of a 1969 Camaro under the guidance of Frank Castellano. The Robert Morrison Restoration Institute had opened its doors just 3 weeks earlier, and already the first class of 12 students was showing remarkable progress under the tutelage of volunteer master craftsmen. Emma emerged from the office space they had created in the former hidden safe room, carrying a clipboard and wearing the kind of focused expression that reminded David daily of his father's meticulous attention to detail. At 18, she had deferred Northwestern for a year to help establish the institute, though her acceptance and scholarship remained secure for the following fall. "The insurance paperwork is finally complete," she announced, checking items off her list. "And the community college partnership is official as of this morning. Our first certified graduates will receive both institute credentials and college credit for their work." David nodded, his attention drawn to a corner of the workshop where Maria Santos, a young woman who had grown up helping in her uncle's auto body shop, was applying primer to a motorcycle tank with the kind of steady hand that suggested natural talent waiting to be developed. The scholarship program had attracted applicants from across 3 states, and the selection process had been both humbling and inspiring. "Your father would be amazed," said Harold Pearson, appearing beside David with his usual quiet approach. The museum curator had become a regular presence at the institute, consulting on authenticity questions and helping students understand the historical significance of their work. "What you've created here goes far beyond anything he could have imagined." David looked around the bustling workshop, hearing the sounds of sanders, the hiss of compressed air, and the quiet conversations between instructors and students. The space hummed with purposeful activity, and the cars being restored would soon carry the knowledge and pride of a new generation of craftsmen. "I think he did imagine it," David replied. "Maybe not the specific details, but the possibility that his collection could become something larger than itself. Every journal entry, every careful documentation, every relationship he built in the community, it was all preparation for this moment." Emma joined them, setting down her clipboard to observe the students at work. "The waiting list for next semester is already longer than our capacity," she reported. "We're going to need to consider expanding again." The success of the institute had surprised everyone, including David. Applications had come not just from young people seeking career training, but from older enthusiasts who wanted to learn proper restoration techniques, professionals looking to upgrade their skills, and even retirees who saw classic car restoration as a meaningful way to spend their later years. "There's something else," Emma continued, pulling a letter from her folder. "Northwestern called this morning. They want to discuss establishing a formal automotive engineering track that would include hands-on restoration training here at the Institute. Students could split their time between campus and our workshops." David felt a surge of pride mixed with amazement. His father's vision was expanding beyond anything they had planned, creating opportunities and connections that seemed to multiply organically. Jake Sullivan approached them, wiping his hands on a shop rag and grinning with the satisfaction of someone who had just mastered a difficult technique. "Mr. Morrison, Frank says I'm ready to start on the bodywork for that Mustang convertible. I can't believe how much I've learned in just 3 weeks." "Your grandfather would have loved working with Jake," Emma told David quietly. "He has the same patience and attention to detail." David watched Jake return to his workstation, remembering his own early experiences in Murphy's garage and the satisfaction of learning to work with his hands. The Institute was providing that same foundation for a new generation, but with better equipment, more systematic instruction, and the kind of comprehensive approach his father had developed over decades of self-taught expertise. The afternoon brought a special visitor, Thomas Harrison, carrying a familiar leather portfolio. The lawyer had become not just the executor of his father's estate, but a friend and advisor, as David had navigated the complex transition from mechanic to institute director. "I have something that belongs here," Harrison said, opening his portfolio to reveal the original restoration journal for the 1967 Mustang Fastback, the car that had started David's journey of discovery. "Your father left specific instructions that this should be displayed once the institute was operational." David opened the journal, reading once again his father's careful documentation of every step in the restoration process. But now the words carried different meaning. Instead of just a record of work completed, the journal represented a teaching tool, a guide that could help other restorers achieve the same level of excellence. "We'll create a display case," Emma suggested. "The journal can be the centerpiece, with photographs of the restoration process and explanations of the techniques. Students can study Grandpa's methods and understand how patience and precision create lasting beauty." As the day wound down and students began cleaning their work areas, David found himself once again in the 1967 Mustang, though now it sat in a place of honor near the Institute's entrance. The car had become more than a restored vehicle. It was a symbol of connection between past and future, between solitary work and shared knowledge, between a father's love and a son's understanding. Emma slid into the passenger seat beside him, as had become their custom at the end of each day. "Dad, do you ever wonder what would have happened if Grandpa had just given you the collection directly instead of making you discover it gradually?" David considered her question, thinking about the anger and resentment he had carried for so long. "I would have seen it as charity or guilt money. I would never have understood the work behind it, the community around it, or the possibilities within it." "He was still teaching you, even after he was gone," Emma observed, "teaching you about patience, about looking deeper, about the difference between receiving something and earning the right to understand it." As they sat in the car that had brought them together with their family's history, David reflected on the journey from that bitter morning when he had received a $1 inheritance to this moment of fulfillment and purpose. His father hadn't just left him money and cars, he had left him a path to becoming the man he was meant to be. The annual Classic Car Show was approaching again, and this year the Robert Morrison Restoration Institute would have its own display featuring work by their first graduating class. Students would present their projects, explain their techniques, and demonstrate the skills they had learned. It would be David's second public appearance in the classic car community. But this time, he would stand not just as Robert Morrison's son, but as the leader of something new and valuable in his own right. The greatest inheritance, David realized, wasn't measured in dollars or cars or real estate. It was measured in understanding, in purpose, and in the ability to transform a legacy of love into something that would benefit others for generations to come. His father had been patient enough to wait 30 years for David to be ready to receive that gift. Now it was David's turn to be patient, to build something lasting, and to trust that the future would honor the foundation they had created together.